My name is Toshi Yoshihara. I'm a senior fellow at CHBA, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. I'm also an adjunct here in the SSP. I teach a course on sea power in the Indo-Pacific. I've been teaching that course. So the last semester was my fourth time around. So been in the program for 4 years, hoping to be here for many more. One of the things that I can talk about here at the outset that will resonate with folks at Georgetown is that I hit a trifecta in this case. So I was a student at Georgetown, teaching at Georgetown, and I published this book through Georgetown Press. Now, I haven't done any in-depth research, but I suspect that the people who have that cross-section of those three things probably very, very small. In fact, I might do a little bit of research to find out if there's one like me out there. The trifecta. In any case, today, well, first of all, thank you all for coming to my book talk. I see many familiar faces from previous courses that I taught. So thanks for being here. Thanks for your moral support. What I'd like to do is to give you a summary of the book, and I want to do it in a more interesting way. Rather than do straight summary of the book, I'm going to offer vignettes. The first part of the vignettes will be based on personalities, some of the Chinese leaders that I covered in the book. And then the second half of my presentation in terms of vignettes will be looking at a disaster on the part of the communists, and then a spectacular success on the part of the communists. That's a way to give you a sense of what are some of the things that I cover. Mao's army goes to sea. It's not responding to my remote for some reason. It worked just now.
Let me go get.
I'll flip the slides then. Yeah, it just worked, but it's not working for some reason. Oh, there you go. All right, thank you. So this is the cover of the book. The cover, this book is in hardcover. Please don't buy the hardcover. It's over $100. It is Georgetown University Press's attempt to break even in sales. When books are that much, only libraries can afford them, and everyone knows that. So they sell the hard copy, the hardcover to libraries to break even in terms of production costs, and then they sell the paperbacks to earn whatever revenue that they can. There's also a Kindle version that's much cheaper. Very surprisingly, I learned a few months ago that an audio version is coming out. Like, why? Who would want to listen to this book? But anyway, I'm happy that it's coming out mid-year, and a Japanese translation will also be coming out mid-year in June of 2020. In any case, what I'd like to do is to start talking about the origins of the Chinese Navy and Chinese sea power, actually from the present. So here's a report published by the Defense Intelligence Agency on Chinese military power. And there's a really interesting passage in this report that I thought would be a good starting point for my book talk. And it's a passage about this beautiful looking warship. It's the type 055 Renhai cruiser. It is currently the world's largest warship in existence. Technically speaking, the US Navy has the Zhongguo, technically larger in terms of displacement, but we've only built 3. And we do not plan to build any more. This is the largest warship in the world that's in serial level. And they're frankly using other warships out like possibly. And here's the passage from the report. And it basically says that the Type 055 Renhai and other warships demonstrated that China is now capable of building the world's most advanced ships in existence. And that, in fact, in certain warfare capabilities, the Chinese Navy has produced ships that actually surpasses the capabilities of their Western counterparts. Now, for those of you who don't study the Chinese military, this is an extraordinary statement, frankly. You could not have imagined a U.S. government agency making this kind of a claim, say, 10 years ago. I would say in 2012, 2013, you would be hard-pressed to find somebody who would issue such a statement like this. But in any case, this in many ways represents our tendency to look at the Chinese military in general, but the Chinese Navy in particular in contemporary terms. We're always so wowed by the most recent developments, the new shiny toys that the Chinese military happens to produce. And the purpose of my book is to bring us back to the origins of Chinese sea power, the Chinese Navy, to give us a little bit of context for not only how far the Chinese have come because of its developmental history, but also to try to link the past to the present. And the purpose of the book is to say, in order for us to understand China's development, these extraordinary achievements of the past decade, we actually have to in part try to understand where the Chinese Navy came. And so I think this picture perfectly encapsulates this sort of dichotomy. China has transitioned from a largely coastal defense force, represented by this surface combatant in the foreground, largely obsolescent Soviet technology, to an increasingly modern power projection force that's represented by the beautiful ship in the background. And the DIA report basically encapsulates our focus on the ship in the background. My purpose in my book is to bring us to the past, is bring us actually to the foreground, to understand the origins of Chinese sea power, to cover the growing gap between what the Chinese Navy was and what the Chinese Navy is and will be in the future. For example, one of the things that has been a central part of Chinese naval doctrine to this day is this idea of sabotage warfare at sea. This idea was formalized in the mid-1950s, although the Chinese, as I show in my book, practiced sabotage warfare as early as 1949 and 1950. This concept basically calls for the Chinese Navy to engage in small-scale engagements using small combatants to attack isolated units, to use deception and surprise to knock the adversary off balance in order to achieve what's called battles of annihilation, battles of quick decision. This remains central to Chinese naval doctrine, and we can't possibly understand Chinese naval doctrine in this context unless we study the past. And even in force structure, this remains very relevant. So the Type 022 catamaran, stealthy coastal combatant fast attack craft, armed to the teeth with long-range anti-ship cruise missiles, is essentially a successor of the sabotage warfare at sea developed in the 1950s. So again, in order for us to understand the origins of this naval design and this capability, we actually have to better understand where this all came from in the late 40s and early 1950s. So with that, what is this story about? Right? What is this book about? It tells the origin story of Chinese sea power. This is different from Chinese naval power, as I defined in my course. I define Chinese sea power very broadly, basically any instrument of national power that can be used to influence events at sea. That means it's not just about big navies, it's not just about warships, it's about all implements of national power, including the Army, the Air Force, the Coast Guard, and all of the other non-military instruments that can be used to influence events at sea. And by telling this origin story, I tell it in two parts. First of all, I'll talk about the Chinese Navy's founding as an institution, and then paralleling the story of standing up this new institution is the story about China's earliest combat experiences in the offshore area. Now, when I talk about these two parallel stories, they're both about institutions. So instead of organizing the book chronologically, I actually organize them around the organizations and institutions responsible for doing these things. So in the first part, I'll look at the regional navy that was first established, and then the national navy that would oversee the regional navies. And then I would be looking at the field armies, in particular the 3rd and 4th Field Armies that were responsible for waging those campaigns to seize these offshore islands. And to tell the story, I draw from an extensive Chinese language literature that's been around for the past 20 years or so, using that literature to let the Chinese speak for themselves. Frequently, I reference folks who were participants in these campaigns, who've written either memoir or provided oral histories of their experiences in these earliest years. Okay, so why tell the story? Firstly, the reason that it's worth telling the story is because it's just not very well documented in the West. It is, as I describe it, it's almost a blank canvas. The earliest history of the Chinese Navy is essentially a footnote, if that, in most Western analysis of the Chinese Navy. And those that are very good are pretty old, published in the 1980s. And the scholars who wrote about the origins of the Chinese Navy in the 1980s did not have the kind of open sources that we now enjoy. And so I'm basically trying to fill what I believe is a major gap in our historiography of Chinese sea power and the Chinese Navy. The second reason why I wanted to write this book is because as I read through the sources, I began to realize that we had a very different or even a wrong conception of the origins of the Chinese Navy. When I came up in my days studying the Chinese Navy, it was conventional wisdom that this period was not really interesting to look at. Nothing much happened. Many of the officers who were chosen to lead the Chinese Navy were chosen for their political loyalty to the party, and that they were basically Soviet automatons. They spent most of the time simply copying from the Soviets. There's nothing original about what they did, and therefore there was really nothing interesting to write about. And because the various army officers were chosen for the ideological loyalty to the party, they neglected the technical aspects that were critical for naval building. But as I read Chinese sources, it turns out that that is a very, very skewed picture. To be sure, ideology mattered, but I found a great deal of pragmatism and a great focus on technical affairs to build up this Navy. And I found that they were, in fact, not automatons. In fact, there was a great deal of Chinese agency in making decisions about where the Chinese was going to go and how the Chinese Navy would embark on its own path, rather than simply follow the Soviet Union's path. What I also found in reading the literature is that they did some pretty amazing things during this period that we don't give them enough credit for. And therefore, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army itself, enjoys a very proud history from which the PLA continues to draw inspiration. And therefore, if we have a better understanding of this past, I argue it would give us a better understanding of how the PLA sees itself, right? Just as the US Navy has this proud tradition, right, that began with the American Revolution, John Paul Jones, right, and all of these heroes in the mythology that have established the US Navy's own identity, I would argue that this period similarly formed this critical institutional identity and memory for the PLA. I would also argue that because of the operational successes that took place during this period, many of the doctrinal and operational preferences that we find in the PLA today can be traced back to this period. Like, for example, that catamaran that I showed you, right? That is in many ways the evolutionary product of their experiences in 1949 and 1950. I also want to say one word about why I chose to focus in on 1940 and 1950. This was a really unique period in Chinese military history because essentially they were on their own. This took place right after they won the communists won the Chinese Civil War and had not gotten a massive infusion of Soviet support. The communists don't get tremendous amounts of Soviet support until the outbreak of the Korean War, where the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, becomes completely Russianized. And they become these doctrinaire Soviet military propagandists, if you will, that spread every aspect of the Soviet military and doctrine throughout all the institutions during and after the Korean War. So we have this very narrow window where the PLA basically had to solve its own problems on its own. It's a rare window into how Chinese strategists dealt with their own problems on their own terms. This is why I focus on this period. All right, so let's start with the background to the story. All right, the story basically begins in the last stages of the Chinese Civil War. Prior to the period that I studied, the nationalists were basically defeated in a series of massive battles in northeast China and in the North China Plain. Hundreds of thousands of nationalist troops were annihilated. Hundreds of thousands of them surrendered and joined the communist side. So this was a period in which the nationalist resistance had largely collapsed. They were in retreat. They were retreating not only to the offshore islands, but they were retreating to Taiwan. It was also at this critical moment that Mao's forces, having defeated the nationalists in these decisive battles, were now on the northern bank of the Yangtze River, the only physical barrier that would prevent Mao to seize all of South China. And it was at this moment, as his armies were getting ready to cross this river, that they realized once they crossed the river and they seized the coastal provinces of China, that they would have to start to fight the nationalists at sea, take the islands that the nationalists were on these offshore islands. Ultimately, of course, the goal was to cross the Taiwan Strait and take Taiwan. So they decided early on in February of 1949, right? So this is what, 8 months before Mao Zedong declares, China has stood up and so forth in Tiananmen in October of 1949. So 8 months before he makes this declaration, he decides China needs to build sea power to take the islands, but also ultimately take Taiwan. And so the communists, as they were poised to cross the Yangtze River, realized that they were essentially trading one set of problems, land warfare, right? Both guerrilla warfare, but conventional warfare, and on land for a entirely new set of problems in a new domain, new capabilities, and that's confronting the nationalists at sea. This was a problem that was going to be particularly severe because the communists had no air power or naval power to speak of. The nationalists, with the help of the US military, essentially had superiority over the seas and over the skies of not only over China itself, but the Taiwan Strait. And so this was the situation that the communists faced when they decided to establish the new navy. So this gives you kind of the geographical coverage for the book. You can imagine Mao's forces arrayed north of the Yangtze River, ready to cross into South China to then sweep in and conquer the coastal China. And so these were all of the various islands where the nationalists had retreated to, and the book basically covers all of the campaigns in these offshore areas with the aim of ultimately taking Taiwan. So this is the question that I try to answer in the book. How does an agrarian land-bound army, right, motivated by revolutionary ideals, go to sea? How does an army composed of largely rural-based peasant soldiers, many of them who've never seen the ocean, many of the officers, frankly, have never seen the ocean, can't swim, are afraid of the ocean, have only heard about the ocean in fairy tales and so forth. How do you retrain this massive organization for this entirely new mission? And that's really the central question that the book tries to answer. All right, now I want you to imagine, this is my first vignette. I want you to teleport yourself into April of 1949. I want you to imagine that you're an up-and-coming, promising rising star in the People's Liberation Army in your late 30s, early 40s. Imagine that you've been wounded in an earlier combat engagement, and you've just returned to duty after convalescing both in the Soviet Union and later in China, and you are desperate to get back into action. Right? You're reporting to duty in order to join your comrades to cross the Yangtze River, right, and to engage in the decisive strategic pursuit and destruction of the remnants of the nationalist army. You go into your theater commander's office, your boss, and you're eagerly awaiting your new orders. And the theater commander says, "Sorry, I have new orders for you. You're going to start a new navy." And you're like, "I don't know anything about naval affairs. I have no training. I have, at best, a middle school education. I was thrown into the revolutionary process at the age of 15. I have no technical training, no knowledge. I can barely swim. I can't possibly do this." He says, theater commander says, "No, you can do it. I didn't choose you for your swimming skills, right? I'm choosing you for your managerial skills, your leadership skills, and your personnel management skills. Because we know that that's what's required to stand up this new institution. Oh, and by the way, Mao Zedong said so." That's an ultimate trump card, right? If Mao agreed that you should take the position, you're going to take the position. And so you agree. And as you're walking out of your boss's office, it finally strikes you. You're going to start this new institution in the new domain, but you have no money, no staff, no force structure, no resources whatsoever. You are essentially a one-man show for this new enterprise. All right, so that is the story of Commander Zhang. pictured here when he was in the naming ceremony of the East China Navy. So when he's told to start this new Navy, he's actually responsible for only one part of it, the regional Navy, the Navy that was going to be centered in east coast of China around Shanghai. This East China Navy would become eventually the East Sea Fleet, or the Eastern Theater Navy that we now know today, the Eastern Theater Fleet that we now know today. So he founded the predecessor of one of the regional fleets. But Mao Zedong had intended the East China Navy to be a laboratory, to test out some ideas that would enable Mao then to construct the new national Navy, the People's Liberation Army Navy. So this is essentially a trial run that is given to this young Army officer. Okay, so what were some of the challenges that Commander Zhang faced? Well, first of all, human capital, right? All of his cadre, all of his officers, all of his troops were these rural-based peasant troops that had no technical knowledge of the Navy. And so he realized early on that in order for him to embark on this project, he would have to rely on the former nationalists, many of them who had surrendered or mutinied and joined the communist side. And many of them actually went into hiding when the communists won and took many of the cities along the coast. So he had to figure out how to build human capital by relying on your former archenemy. Think about that, right? You've just fought over 2 decades and frequently vicious fighting, right? For over 2 decades, you're now being asked to basically accept them and incorporate them into your organization to start up this Navy. Not because you're doing it out of goodwill, you're doing it because you have to, you're doing it out of necessity. In terms of capabilities, this was really a sad story too for Zhang. So the nationalists took their best ships and moved them over to Taiwan, and they proceeded to destroy whatever ships that they left behind. So what Zhang had at the time were basically secondhand, third-hand, hand-me-down Navy, essentially. Many of these ships were Imperial Japanese Navy ships that were given to the nationalists as reparations, which were then captured by the communists. Some of the ships went all the way back to the Republican period, and some of them went all the way back to the Qing dynasty, like ships that were a part of the Beiyang fleet, right? All right, so now imagine these ships that covered a 40-year period, right? Now, the Chinese didn't build any of these ships on their own. These were all foreign ships. They bought them from the Italians, they bought them from the French, they bought them from the British, they got some from the Japanese, they got some even from the US Navy. Now imagine ships of varying quality, of varying sizes, of varying national origins in trying to create a national Navy out of it, right? I mean, when I was reading this, I felt for Zhang. I was like, man, dude, you know, I really feel sorry for you. I mean, this is a really, really difficult task confronting you. In terms of personnel too, if you're going to draw from the nationalists, you're going to have to integrate them with your existing cadre. You've got communist cadre who have blood on their hands, killing nationalists and vice versa. People who are ideologically opposed, people who tend to have a rural outlook, people who deeply distrust the bourgeois lifestyle of the officers and the men of the nationalist Navy. How do you bring them together, right? That's another major challenge. And finally, Zhang understood that he obviously needed to rely on the nationalists. He needed to eventually rely on the Soviets for technical support, but he needed to ensure that this learning took place in the context of the PLA's finest traditions. In other words, he couldn't simply borrow unthinkingly and uncritically from the nationalists and the Soviets, right? All of these ideas and doctrine had to have PLA imprint in order to get buy-in, right? It had to have some element that represented the PLA's finest traditions. So one of the difficulties that Zhang faced was how do you then integrate these various sources of learning into something that could produce this new institution? All right, now I'm going to give you the second vignette, which is another leader, and this is Rear Admiral Lin. He was actually a commander of the ROC Navy, the Nationalist Navy, right? He grew up in a Navy family. His father commanded warships in the Beiyang fleet. Lin later was sent to the UK and Germany to study naval affairs. He was actually sent here to Washington to become the assistant naval attaché representing the nationalist government. Admiral Lin was also the commander of the fleet that sailed down to the Spratlys to recover the Spratlys to the nationalist regime in 1946. This is in many ways the origins of China's dispute with claimants in the South China Sea. It goes all the way back to this expedition. Taiping Island, which is the major feature occupied by the ROC. It's the largest feature, actually, Ituaba. Taiping Island, the name Taiping was named by him because I believe he commanded the flagship at the time called Taiping. So the origins, in many ways, of the Spratlys dispute that we keep hearing about today goes all the way back to this period, and it goes specifically back to Admiral Lin. All right, so what did he do? Well, he mutinies. So prior to the communists crossing over the Yangtze River, Lin basically turns over his entire fleet, the second squadron, that was designed to guard the approaches to the Yangtze River. He was working with underground agents, secret agents, who had basically convinced them to turn over the fleet at a very critical time. And of course, by taking away the fleet, it made it that much easier for the communists to cross the Yangtze River. But it also meant that he was able to turn over an entire fleet to the communists virtually overnight. This was a massive turn of events, and for his task of turning over these capabilities, he was almost immediately appointed to be the deputy commander of the East China Navy. Imagine that. This nationalist officer who had grown up through the ranks of the nationalist regime becomes Commander Zhang's right-hand man, virtually overnight. And later, he would become the deputy commander of the East Sea Fleet in the early 1970s during the throes of the Cold War. Pretty remarkable story. And again, how does Zhang manage this transition? Right? How does he convince Lin, and how does he re-educate Lin so that Lin is sort of acceptable to the communist officers and cadre? And there is Lin Zun with his delegation. There's Zhang Haiping right here. Zhang Haiping actually led a delegation of former nationalists to meet with Mao Zedong and the top leadership in Beijing. And it was at this meeting that Mao Zedong tried to reassure the nationalist leadership that we're going to look beyond the past, and we're going to try to collaborate together to create the new Navy. So this was a very deliberate attempt to bring the enemy in from the cold, from the very, very top. And here is Admiral Lin now in communist PLA uniform. And this conversion, if you will, or this defection, is a major feature of the Chinese Civil War. You know, as I said, hundreds of thousands of troops basically defected and joined the communist side. That actually had a much bigger impact on the battlefield outcome of the Chinese Civil War than the actual attrition and the casualties and the killing of troops. All right, in any event, what I want to do now is to talk about some of the operations that took place. The 3rd Field Army responsible for the East Coast and the 4th Field Army responsible for the southern coast of China. They engaged in a very wide range of operations. Notably, the 4th Field Army conducted the Hainan operation. They landed 45,000 troops in that operation. That would make the Hainan campaign probably one of the largest in post-war history. Pretty remarkable. All right, so I want to talk about one disaster, and it's the Jinmen campaign in October of 1949. Here is the main island, Jinmen, and then there's Xiamen, another very big metropolis. And so I tell a story of how the communists tried to but failed to take Jinmen, which was seen as the gateway to Taiwan. Mao planned that if you take Jinmen, then you can use that area as a launch pad to take Taiwan. Again, to put that in context, Jinmen is a tiny little island just off the coast of mainland. It remains in nationalist hands, not national hand, it remains in Republic of China hands. It remains a constant reminder of the division of China and Taiwan, and that division begins in October of 1945. All right, so what happened? Well, the communists were just absolutely terrible. The 3rd Field Army screwed everything up, right? I mean, if you wanted to identify a thoroughly bad strategy just look at how the communists tried to take Jinmen and they're not. First of all, they had terrible intel. They actually missed the fact that the nationalists were significantly reinforcing the garrison at Vignette. They had bad command and control. They basically had one core organization oversee the units of another corps that they knew nothing about. They had a shipping shortage. This was probably the most important problem, was that in taking Xiamen, which was the island next to Jinmen, they lost a lot of civilian shipping. Oh, and by the way, to engage in this amphibious operation, they all had to rely on civilian shipping. They conscripted basically fishermen and other civilian boats to carry the troops. And when these civilians saw what happens to you when you get caught in the crossfire, when your ship gets destroyed, when your boat gets destroyed, many of them being conscripted to Jinmen just fled. They took their boats and just fled. Like, I'm not getting it. You know, I'm lucky that I survived the first round. And oh, and by the way, these were all junks. These were non-motorized sailing boats that they relied on in order to get across these narrow waters. The plan was bad because of the shortage of shipping. They had this very convoluted, complex plan where they would ship in the first wave of attackers. Then they would count on those ships, again, non-motorized, to sail back across to the mainland to bring the second wave ashore, right? You have to make a lot of assumptions about it. Oh, and by the way, the first wave that you bring ashore would be half strength. And you really require that second wave in order for you to, at least at a minimum, maintain your lodgement and then conduct your offensive operations to the Jinmen. And then it was badly executed. When the first wave showed up, they're widely spread along the beaches because of the wind conditions. So the ships were dispersed everywhere, the troops landed everywhere, and they just charged inland without expectation, well, without waiting for reinforcements to arrive. All right, so what happened? Absolute disaster. So the other thing about bad intel is they didn't study the tides. So the ships, the first wave reach the beaches, troops get off, and then the tide recedes. So all of those ships are now stranded on the mudflats. And now when daylight breaks, because this was a nighttime operation, the nationalists now use their superior air power and sea power to destroy literally every single stranded boat on the beach. So now your attempt to bring a second wave is over, right? Now, there's actually some great stories of the second wave troops standing. They can see that first wave. They can see the boats that were supposed to come back to pick them up burning on the beaches. And they can see their comrades getting annihilated on those beaches. Right? It was a horrific sight. So the troops that are there, of course, because they're under strength, they're not able to break through in many of these areas. Also, because of the reinforcement that the nationalists had, the nationalists actually have tanks. They use Sherman tanks, American-built Sherman tanks, combined arms tactics to completely wipe out the communists. It was basically slaughter. And by the end of the third or fourth day, the communists lose all 9,000 troops trapped on the island. Absolute disaster. All right, it's a huge setback for the communist type man. Mao acknowledges that this was the biggest disaster of the last 18 months of the Chinese Civil War. And he says we have to study this failure. And plus, not only that, all optimistic plans for taking Taiwan are dashed. They're gone. They have to now go back to the drawing board to start over. And of course, this stalemate on Jinmen then leads to huge flashpoints during the Cold War. The 1954 and the 1958 Taiwan Strait crisis, where did it happen? Over Jinmen, right? And so Jinmen represents essentially the continued division of China and Taiwan through many Chinese strategists. And it's also for PLA officers a classic case study about what not to do. All right, I want to now talk about a major success that I just mentioned, the Hainan Island operation. So this is the close-in map. It's the northern coast of Hainan. The communists are basically gathering, assembling forces on the Peninsula to cross over.
Yeah, I only know a couple.
All right. So in the context of the larger map of China, there's Hainan, right? Hainan is the second major island in size to Taiwan. If you want to put it in U.S. terms, it's about the size of Maryland. It's pretty sizable. All right, the Fourth Field Army does this, and it does everything differently compared to the Third Field Army. They engage in meticulous planning. They engage in meticulous learning from the failure at Jinmen. they engage in really impressive preparations in terms of intelligence gathering, training the troops for sea crossing, gathering enough ships to transport the troops across the strait, the mobilization of the entire society, the entire coastal community on Leizhou Peninsula to get them to provide the troops with the resources that they need. They also deployed all sorts of defensive works, including air defense artillery units to keep nationalist air power away from the assembling forces. And interestingly enough, this is a fascinating story. There's this column, an insurgent group called the Chongya Column, that were resident forces on Hainan. They've been operating as insurgents on Hainan for decades, and fighting not only nationalists, but their fighting goes all the way back to fighting the Imperial Japanese Army. And so the communists basically had a plan to link up with these local insurgents to tip the balance of power. And so what did they do? They had this really clever smuggling campaign. They basically got the troops to sail down the east and western coasts of Hainan away from the heavily defended garrisoned areas to insert these troops. And these troops would link up with the Chongya Column, and then they would be brought into the base area in the inaccessible interior of Hainan. And their goal was, with this added force, would be to conduct harassment attacks against nationalist forces from the rear. Operationally, they were able to land 25,000 troops in the first wave, which was basically overwhelming force. The Chongya Column, the insurgents, and the advanced PLA units were able to tie down the nationalists from the rear. Those forces that landed were able to break through their lodgements and conduct their battles of encirclement. And they replicate actually exactly the battles of annihilation that they were able to wage on the mainland itself. The nationalists collapsed very rapidly, and the communists basically seized all of Hainan in quick succession. What are the strategic consequences? Well, it was obviously a major victory for the communists. It was a very sharp contrast to Jinmen. It sort of wiped away some of the humiliation from that significant loss. It takes away a massive piece of territory from which the nationalists might have launched attacks against the communist positions on the mainland. It also gave China, of course, a commanding position over the South China Sea, that position that remains to this day. We know that Hainan is home to a significant component of Chinese naval power. And so having Hainan passed on significant amount of geostrategic and military leverage to the communists. All right, so let me conclude very briefly with a couple of implications and legacies from this history. First of all, clearly, many of these offshore campaigns provide very relevant, useful lessons for taking Taiwan. They include the importance of properly estimating the enemy. Don't ever underestimate the adversary, which was the problem with attacking Jinmen. They emphasize the need to be absolutely ready with all of the material that's required to take an island feature. And that in part demands the use of overwhelming mass and firepower directed against the adversary, in this case would be Taiwan. And of course, the successful role of the Chongya Column would suggest the importance that the communists placed on fifth column forces on Taiwan to be a concern for defense planners both in the United States and in Taiwan itself. The use of leave behind forces that would engage in disruptive activities when PLA plans a major conventional operation against the island. I mean, all of these resonate with Chinese strategists to a very good. All right. All right. The other piece in terms of legacies is the regional fleet system. So what was really interesting about the Third and Fourth Field Army is that they eventually became the occupation forces of the territories that they occupied. So once they came to Fujian, for example, the Third Field Army basically set their roots and settled in and became the garrison force. And that means that the regional military commands were dominated by the Third Field Army in that area. The Fourth Field Army similarly settled down in Guangdong, and they then became the power center in terms of military power in that region. And because of the intricate patronage system and the networks that they established, that meant that the Third and Fourth Field Army basically passed on their institutional DNA to the regional commands, including the regional fleets. And I was able to trace in my book, for example, if you run from the 50s all the way to the 1960s, not surprisingly, all the commanders and deputy commanders and the political commissars of the EC fleet were all originally leaders of the Third Field Army. Go to the South Sea Fleet, all of the commanders, deputy commanders, and the political commissars of those organizations all fought in the Fourth Field Army. And so you have these regional military structures organized around the Field Army, and it suggests that even the fleet system today may have inherited many of the institutional proclivities and personalities of those field armies. The second legacy is the civil military nexus, right? We frequently think about, China's clever use of the Coast Guard, China's clever use of the maritime militia as if there's something new. No, I mean, it simply reflects the communist high degree of comfort in integrating civilian assets for military purposes arguably from the very founding of the Chinese Communist Party, right? The ability to tap into society, Mao Zedong's concept of people's war. All of these things were very consistent with how the communists employed civilians, including civilian shipping, to achieve their operational aims. There are also some lasting values and ethos that continue to be reflected in Chinese naval doctrine to this very day. The small ship ethos that I talked about can be traced back to this period. The predilection for deception and surprise traces back to this period, right? The idea that you can convert weakness into strength over time, right, using these tactics, traces back to this period when they faced a materially and technologically superior adversary in the form of the nationalists. So I conclude in the book that instead of overlooking this history, instead of downplaying this history, instead of saying that this history has very little to teach us, I think it's worth noting that the PLA certainly thinks that it has a very great history here that it can be very proud of. And that how the PLA retells and retails this story to itself tells us a lot about the PLA. And so if we neglect this history, then we're missing a big piece of helping us taking measure to take measure of, to diagnose the PLA as an institution today and into the future. So with that, I will conclude my remarks, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Any thoughts, questions, reactions? Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor, for a very interesting talk. I don't know anything about the Navy, so this is actually very instructive for me. I was wondering, institutionally, given their history of amphibious operations, the third and fourth armies have like marine divisions, or is that just not an institutional thing?
Yeah, so the PLA has a Marine Corps that it is setting up, that it has set up, and that they will likely be the tip of the spear for these types of operations. And so, yeah, I think it'd be interesting to see to what extent the Marine Corps today within the PLA inherited some of these traditions and some of these outlooks. And that would be an interesting kind of follow-on project. Yes.
Is the Southern Fleet today any better because of the legacy of the Fourth Army, or have they kind of, the whole Chinese Navy learned from the success of that operation versus the Third Army?
Yeah, so I think it's probably harder and harder to draw a straight line from the Fourth Field Army's sort of initial influence to today. But what is interesting about what makes this idea of the regional fleet system really interesting is that the Fourth Field Army and the Third Field Army and their predecessors were operating in very different regional areas, which meant that these field armies developed their own personality. And presumably, they're able to pass on that unique personality down to the regional fleets. One of the methodological challenges for someone like me on the outside looking in is that the regional fleets are particularly difficult to decipher because they're operational organizations, and the PLA tends to be very mum. They're very quiet about the operational side. So you would have to kind of have access to that kind of information that's not likely going to be available. But if it were ever available, I think you could try to piece together how some of those personalities those institutional personalities may have trickled down into the South Sea Fleet. Now, I think what is tracing that institutional legacy more difficult too is that because of the reforms in 2015, 2016, we're now looking at an increasingly joint theater command. And so to what extent does inter-service collaboration maybe dilute some of that institutional personality would also be something that we'd have to take into. So in the front, but yes, go ahead.
So when and where do we start to see evolution towards blue water? And velocity water? This is all been sort of coastal operation.
Right. Yeah. So I think, so I basically argue in the book that at a minimum, what the book does is establish a baseline, right? And say, if China is indeed going for a global blue water navy that in many ways reflects what we do in terms of what the U.S. Navy does, then it will give us a sense of how much of an institutional departure it is going to be, right? So it establishes a benchmark. However, I would also argue that if you read some of the more recent Chinese naval doctrine, Admiral Lin, who was the previous commander of the Chinese Navy, talked about conducting exterior line operations, right? And this idea of conducting exterior line operation using guerrilla forces, for example, I would argue traces its origins to this kind of thinking. So even when they're talking about projecting power into the Indian Ocean, they're still applying a lot of this old framework, forces between interior and exterior lines, conducting battles of annihilation using guerrilla-like forces in the Indian Ocean. So it seems to me that it's worth thinking about how this historical legacy then sort of helps Chinese leaders frame the way they think about global power projection. And I speculate basically that whatever China develops in terms of its global presence and global capabilities will not likely look anything like the structure that we have put in place. It's going to be, as people like to say, power projection with Chinese characteristics. I hate to use that phrase. It's the shorthand to say that the PLA will likely will likely rely on its own traditions to define how they think about power projection, and that's going to look different in the way we. Yes, it's on hand there.
Right? Yeah. So, Professor, I'm also fairly neophyte when it comes to Chinese Navy stuff. Appreciate you put this on. My question has to do with kind of the. I don't know if this is anecdotal, but just hear about sort of the rivalry that kind of exists between kind of the ground forces versus the Navy.
Mhm.
When did, from your presentation, you sort of see how the Navy, in a lot of ways, sort of an extension of the Army. When did the Navy begin to sort of develop its own kind of character, and when did that sort of tension really sort of emerge between the ground element and the naval element?
I mean, some would argue that extension has never been broken, right? That the PLA Navy remains an extension of the PLA ground force, and that its outlook is deeply influenced by its landward origin. Some would argue that remains very much in place. But I think, if I were to say, if there was any point at which there was a break, it was likely the period under Liu Shen, who really accelerated the naval modernization, the power projection force we're seeing today. Were all, many of those seeds were implanted by him during his tenure about a decade ago. And so that's when we began to see, certainly in terms of force structure, a break away from the more regionally, locally oriented force structure. And yet, as I mentioned, even he who has this vision of making China into the Chinese Navy into a blue water power is still using analogies that Mao Zedong himself would have recognized, right? So basically using landward concepts to try to frame how he thinks about power projection. So in that sense, I think it's still a mixed influence. I think it'd be difficult institutionally to ever really break away from that Army-centric tradition. And so I think what this book does is, again, help you measure the degree of departure from that lasting legacy. Yes, go ahead.
During the Hainan invasion, how exactly did Plan get to have like either naval or air supremacy, or I suppose both? Or
Yeah.
had the nationalists already lost that by that point, or just didn't have active commentary there? So they
So the communists still had no significant aircraft to speak of during this period. A lot of the aircraft would be deployed later on, especially during the buildup for the Korean War. So they had no air superiority, and they had no sea control whatsoever. They had no major surface combatants. So they were operating under contested domains, basically, both in the air and at sea. You raised an interesting point, which was was the Hainan success a function of communist brilliance or nationalist incompetence? Because what we find is that, if you look at the sources, the nationalists had actually withdrawn their best assets to Taiwan. It was also at a time where funding from the US actually dried up because we were still kind of sitting on the fence, deciding whether we still wanted to support the nationalists, right? Because of nationalist incompetence, corruption and so forth, we had cut off a lot of our support. So the nationalists were in steep decline. And so there were some real concerns as to whether the nationalists actually had the forces they claimed they did during this period. And of course, you also needed to combine that with the fact that the communists had essentially constructed their own, in contemporary parlance, anti-access area denial bubble over the Leizhou Peninsula. So they created enough land-based air defense to deny nationalist air power over that area. And then I think with a combination of mass, they basically overwhelmed the naval patrols that were present in the strait. So it's a combination of these factors. And so, where would I stand, in terms of this debate? I think the conventional wisdom would typically say it's nationalist incompetence, corruption, and inability to harness their material capabilities. I think my revisionist account would say let's give the communists some credit for coming up with this plan that made this. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I have two questions.
Sure.
The first was if you came across anything that indicated ROC and US perceptions of the initial stages of China building up its navy.
Yeah.
And second was whether at that time of the decades after, kind of organization of political thinking, the PLA and the PLA Navy had towards specific technologies that they had a huge qualitative deficit in, and how they plan to overcome it. I'm associating that specifically with the difference between US and Chinese capabilities in undersea warfare today.
Yeah.
So in the
Yeah,
past, how
sure.
have they viewed stuff like that?
Sure. So those are two really important questions. So I actually cite ROC sources in the book to talk about how they assess the campaigns in particular. I also cite CIA reporting. The CIA was actually reporting on this. And it's extraordinary these days, right? Like you can actually get the CIA reporting from 4950 online. Just go to their website and you can pull up all the stuff. It's really quite amazing. It's not clear the sources and methods of the CIA reporting. I suspect a lot of it were fed by the nationalists, but they were actually providing some very different accounts. And so I try to use the CIA and ROC sources as a way to triangulate the ground truth, because I think the communists, and I know in the report, in the book that the communist accounts frequently were characterized by triumphalism. And it's kind of their job, right, to mythologize their successes. So there tends to be a lot of hagiography involved in literature. So you really needed to cross-check that with how the ROC military and how the Americans view the situation. And you can see in many of these examples where the communists tended to downplay or underplay their combat losses. If you look at the nationalist and the CIA accounts, my gosh, the communists were actually suffering quite a bit of losses during this period. So I think, it's always important to use these other sources to cross-check, to balance out some of these narratives. And I think a more complete study would be actually digging into ROC archives to see, how do their accounts differ from the communist version of that. And that's basically for the next project. As for the capabilities question, yeah, so Xiao Jingguang, who was the commander of the national Chinese Navy, right, who took command of the PLAN, had a conference in August of 1950 that I document in the book. And it was at that conference that they decided on essentially a force structure that was well suited to the limited aim that they were seeking for. And their aim was to engage in coastal defense, right, near coast defense, to impose costs on enemy forces that would seek to invade the mainland. And so in order to achieve these much more modest aims, they decided on a three-part force structure. And the three-part force structure is fast attack craft, shore-based aircraft, and submarines. That the combination of these three forces would be able to defend the coastal approaches to the mainland. And it's not surprising that during the Cold War, the Chinese imported or built tons and tons of conventional submarines. And we still see that legacy, right? And they're able to build on that legacy to build some pretty potent conventional submarine capabilities today, right? Like the Song class submarine that they have in service. I wouldn't want to mess with them. They're some serious capabilities. So again, one can't really understand some of these, you might call niche capabilities that the Chinese were able to develop. You can't really understand that without understanding this period where they made these force structure decisions decades before.
Thank you.
Sure. I think there was another question in the back.
Yeah, I did
Yeah,
have one.
sure.
I just wasn't,
ahead.
didn't want to hold everyone up. I was just gonna ask, this is more, my background is a little bit more in like the political realm. Has there been a different focus on developing PLAN capabilities under different Chinese leaders, or has it kind of seemed as like a consistent goal of like the party in China overall as they progress to kind of build up that strength?
Yeah, so what is really interesting is that one of the successors to Commander Xiao, and by the way, Commander Xiao is commander of the Chinese Navy for like 30 years. It's he had a pretty remarkable career. So he had a very lasting, deep imprint. And so in many ways, part of the job of future commander is to break away from that legacy. And what we saw, certainly in the early 1980s, when General Liu Huaqing became the commander of the Chinese Navy, he's frequently credited as being the founder of the modern Chinese Navy. And even as early as the 1980s, General Liu Huaqing had set out a set of naval strategy objectives that were increasingly outward looking. And it's outward looking because he had to match it up with China's grand strategy. And so if you recall, late 1970s, Deng Xiaoping comes to power, right, consolidates his power and engages in reform and opening. And I talk about this in one of my classes in my course, which is that it's during that period that Deng Xiaoping understood that if China wants to repudiate the Maoist past and turn decisively to essentially accept and embrace the US-led global order, which is going to be premised on maritime trade and commerce, that in order to be a part of that system so that China can use maritime trade to become strong and powerful, that it would have to embrace the seas. So it was as early as 1979 that Deng Xiaoping asked essentially his naval cadre to begin thinking in those terms. So General Liu Huaqing, when he took the reins in the early 1980s, basically followed up with that plan by having a really long-term thinking about what Chinese naval strategy would be. And it included things like building a navy that can defend China's sea lanes by the mid-1980s. He has this long list of Chinese naval missions in peacetime and in wartime. And if you look at that list, it's kind of funny because it comes out in 1986. The Chinese Navy in 1986 could not fulfill like the vast majority of those missions, right? And so General Liu understood that these were aspirational goals the Chinese Navy had to seek to achieve. So what we're seeing today is in many ways, the fulfillment of some of those intellectual aspirational goals that were set forth in the early 1980s, that Chinese military and naval power was finally able to kind of close the gap and reach those objectives. So I would say that they've been essentially striving towards that goal since the late 1970s, certainly throughout the 1980s. So it's been a long process. And I guess that's another part of my message in talking about the Chinese Navy is that we typically focus on capabilities, and we're so surprised that they're able to sprint to produce these capabilities. But I would argue, if you look at the history of their intellectual development, that really the Navy that we're seeing today, that Navy is the fruit of all of that intellectual investment, material investment that they made decades before.